I'm Oakley Miles. For 22 years, I built and maintained the core data infrastructure for Apex Dynamics. Every database, encryption protocol, and failsafe that kept the company secure and operational. I trained the team myself because no one else understood the systems. The shift came when Colton Rivers brought his son Garrett into the executive suite. Garrett, 26, fresh from business school and brimming with inherited confidence, was introduced as the new leader of a so-called operational modernization initiative. If you're new here and enjoying these powerful stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more. Let me know in the comments what part of today's story touched you most. At an emergency meeting, Garrett presented a slick slide deck filled with jargon, criticizing my disaster recovery flowchart as redundant, and branding our proven systems as costly legacy tech. He proposed migrating to cloud services, cutting staffing, and making me obsolete under the guise of an advisory role. Advisory capacity, I said, setting down my coffee. You mean watch you dismantle what I built while you extract my knowledge before firing me? Colton cut in, decline, and I'd be creating friction during a critical growth period, a clear threat. I walked out knowing the truth. This wasn't about innovation. It was nepotism. And they'd forgotten one crucial detail. In 2003, I'd built much of the infrastructure through my own LLC, DataShield Consulting, licensing it to the company. I retained intellectual property rights under a clause in my original contract, rights they'd never purchased outright. Over the next 3 days, I worked quietly, documenting every system and securing encrypted backups of all proprietary architecture, licenses, and invoices, my work stored on my own terms. When Garrett announced the initiative company-wide without mentioning me, I knew it was time. Monday morning, I arrived early and initiated the sequence. Revoked the DataShield licensing agreement with 72-hour notice. Deactivated the sync protocols for my proprietary monitoring tools, disconnecting their visibility into the systems. I archived my personal documentation, 22 years of notes, diagrams, and institutional knowledge, and exported it securely. Then I wrote my resignation letter, clear and final. Effective immediately, I was resigning as senior infrastructure architect. Per my original contract, I was terminating the licensing agreement between DataShield Consulting and Peak Dynamics with 72 hours notice. All proprietary tools developed under that agreement would be deactivated when the notice period ended. I printed 2 copies, handed one to HR, and walked straight to Colton's office. He was on the phone, laughing, feet up on his desk. I placed the letter on his desk without a word. He looked at it, confused. You can't just quit in the middle of a transition. I can, and I am, I said. The notice started this morning at 6:47 a.m. His face turned red. After everything this company has done for you. Everything I've done for this company? I interrupted. I built your infrastructure from the ground up. And now you bring in your unqualified son to dismantle it? In 72 hours, when my licensing expires, you'll see how much of your modern operation runs on systems you never owned. He stared. What are you talking about? Read the letter. You licensed my tools. You never bought them. You just assumed they were yours. The realization hit him like ice water. You can't. I can. Good luck with your modernization, Colton. I'm sure Garrett will figure it out. I walked out before he could respond. By the time I reached my car, my phone was buzzing. Messages from HR, my old team, even the CTO. I ignored them all. I drove home slowly, then made a real cup of coffee. I had 72 hours to watch it unfold. And I was going to enjoy every minute. The first sign came by Tuesday morning, barely 18 hours later. The support tickets were already piling up. A text from Lydia, one of my former developers. Oakley, the monitoring dashboard is blank. Did you change something? I deleted it. An email from Greg, the IT director. We're having visibility issues. Any chance you can point us to the documentation? I archived it. Then a voicemail from Colton trying to sound calm. Oakley, there's been a miscommunication. We need you back. This is urgent. I deleted it too. That's the thing about infrastructure. It's invisible until it fails. No one notices the systems that prevent disasters. Not until they're gone. I hadn't destroyed anything. I'd simply turned off access to what was mine. Their core systems still ran, but without my monitoring tools or diagnostics, they were flying blind. Like driving a car with no dashboard. By Wednesday afternoon my phone rang again. Unknown number. A lawyer from Whitmore and Associates representing Peak Dynamics. Ms. Miles, there seems to be confusion. Our client believes the tools are company property. They're mistaken, I said calmly. I developed them independently. They licensed them. I terminated that license. It's all documented. Pause. Papers shuffled. We've reviewed the contract, though the language is somewhat ambiguous. It's not ambiguous, I cut in. Section 9, subsection D. Ownership remained with me unless explicitly purchased. They never did. This is about contract law, not feelings. You had 22 years to buy the IP rights and chose not to, I said. Now you have options. Rebuild from scratch in 6 months, hire someone to reverse engineer it, or license it from me at fair market value. And what's that? Amanda asked. More than you paid me for 2 decades of work, I replied. I'll send a proposal by week's end. Colton showed up Friday with an offer of $250,000. I didn't touch the paperwork. That's an insult. My systems took 22 years to build. Your son couldn't replicate them in a lifetime. My price includes safeguards so he can't dismantle critical infrastructure without oversight. You can't attach conditions to a sale, he argued. Watch me. You want access? Then accept my terms. This isn't extortion, it's capitalism. He called it vindictive. I called it overdue. You wanted me to apologize to Garrett while he dismantled everything I built. Now you're on my porch asking for help. Get off my property. You'll have my proposal by Friday. They were desperate by the time I sent the $1.8 million licensing agreement, complete with third-party audit clauses and security protections. No transfer of ownership, just a 5-year lifeline so they could fix their own mess. Then I slept in. For the first time in years there were no alarms, no crises, just peace. I made breakfast slowly, actual breakfast, not a protein bar scarfed down in the car, and sat at my kitchen table reading the news on my tablet. There was an article about cybersecurity breaches at mid-sized companies, how many of them were suffering from technical debt and inadequate infrastructure maintenance. I wondered if Peak would make that list in a few months if they didn't get their act together. My phone rang at 10:23 a.m. Unknown number again, but this time with a New York area code. I answered cautiously. Ms. Miles? This is Elliot Hartman. I'm a partner at Whitmore and Associates, and I've been asked to take over negotiations regarding the Data Shield consulting matter. A partner. They were escalating. Good. Mr. Hartman, I replied. What can I do for you? I've reviewed your proposal, he said, his voice measured and professional. Comprehensive. Perhaps more comprehensive than necessary. Comprehensive enough to reflect 22 years of development work, I countered. Fair point. However, the financial terms are going to be challenging for my client. $1.8 million for a 5-year license extension significantly exceeds their current budget allocation. Then they should increase their budget allocation, I said simply. Or they can spend the next 6 months rebuilding everything from scratch while their competitors poach their clients. Their choice. Elliot was silent for a moment. Then, what if we structured it differently? A smaller upfront payment with ongoing royalties based on system usage. Not interested. Lump sum or annual licensing fee. No royalties, no performance clauses. I'm not going to let them drag this out for years while nickel-and-diming me every quarter. Ms. Miles, I understand you feel you were treated unfairly. I don't feel I was treated unfairly, I interrupted. I was treated unfairly. There's a difference. One is perception, the other is fact. And the fact is that Peak Dynamics benefited from my expertise for 2 decades, compensated me inadequately, and then attempted to push me out the moment I became inconvenient to someone's nepotism project. That's a fairly harsh characterization. It's an accurate one. And frankly, Mr. Hartman, I don't care if they think it's harsh. They created this situation. I'm just responding to it. He sighed. I could hear papers rustling in the background again. What if we removed some of the operational restrictions? He suggested. The provisions about third-party audits and modification approvals. Those are going to be non-starters for my client. They need operational flexibility. And I need assurance that they're not going to take my systems and immediately destroy them through incompetence, I replied. Those provisions stay non-negotiable. Then we're at an impasse. No, Mr. Hartman. You're at an impasse. I'm fine. I have other consulting opportunities. I'm sleeping better than I have in years, and my blood pressure is probably the lowest it's been since 2008. Your client, on the other hand, is hemorrhaging operational visibility and facing potential regulatory scrutiny. So you tell me who's really got the problem here. Another pause. Longer this time. I'll take your position back to the client, he said finally. But I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think they're going to accept these terms. Then they don't accept them, I said. And in 72 hours, when the licensing grace period expires completely, they'll be operating fully blind. Good luck explaining that to your clients and your board of directors. I hung up before he could respond. I wasn't bluffing. The grace period I'd built into the shutdown sequence was set to expire Monday morning at 9 a.m. After that, every single monitoring tool, diagnostic system, and automated alert I'd built would go completely dark. They'd still have their core operations, databases, servers, client portals, but they'd have no way to see problems coming until they became disasters. And disasters were inevitable. They always were. Sunday evening, I got a text message from Christina in HR. Oakley, I know I probably shouldn't be contacting you, but people are freaking out. Colton called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. There's talk of suing you for sabotage and breach of contract. Please be careful. I appreciated the warning, but I wasn't worried. I'd been meticulous about documenting everything. Every clause, every agreement, every piece of evidence that proved I'd operated within my legal rights. If they wanted to sue, they'd lose. Expensively. I texted back. Thanks for the heads up. I'll be fine. You should start updating your resume though. Things are about to get messy over there. She replied with a frowning emoji. Monday morning, I woke up at 8:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the grace period expired, and made myself a cup of coffee. Then I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, watching the clock on the wall tick toward 9 o'clock. I wasn't logged into any of Peak's systems. That would have been inappropriate. But I didn't need to be. I knew exactly what was going to happen. At 9 a.m. the automated licensing verification would fail. The monitoring tools would detect an invalid license key and shut down gracefully. No crashes, no data loss, just a clean disconnect. Like turning off a light switch. At 9:02 a.m., the first alerts would stop flowing. Operations staff would notice that their dashboards were frozen, showing the last data snapshot from 8:59 a.m. At 9:05 a.m., someone would try to restart the monitoring services and realize they couldn't. The license validation would fail and the systems would refuse to initialize. At 9:10 a.m., panic would set in. My phone started ringing at 9:07 a.m. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call. And another. By 9:15 I had 6 missed calls and a dozen text messages, all variations of the same theme. The systems are down. Please help. What do we do? I didn't respond to any of them. At 9:47 a.m. my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Elliot Hartman standing on my porch with a briefcase and an expression that suggested he'd been up all night. I opened the door. Mr. Hartman, I said calmly. This is a surprise. Ms. Miles, my client has asked me to convey that they're prepared to accept your terms. I raised an eyebrow. All of them. All of them, he confirmed. The $1.8 million licensing fee, the operational safeguards, the third-party audit requirements. Everything. They just need you to restore access immediately. I leaned against the doorframe. Immediately, I repeated. That's interesting. Because when I proposed reasonable transition terms last week, your client called it extortion. Now it's an emergency and suddenly my terms are acceptable. Funny how that works. Elliot shifted his weight uncomfortably. Ms. Miles, I understand your position, but there's a client presentation happening in 3 hours that depends on real-time operational metrics. If those systems aren't restored, then the presentation will be embarrassing, I finished for him. And maybe that's what needs to happen. Maybe Colton Rivers needs to stand in front of a room full of investors and explain why his modernization initiative has left the company flying blind. You're putting thousands of jobs at risk. No, I said sharply. Colton put those jobs at risk when he prioritized his son's ego over operational stability. I'm just declining to clean up the mess for free. Elliot opened his briefcase and pulled out a document. This is a contract. Standard licensing agreement with all your requested terms. If you sign it right now, we can wire the first payment, $900,000, within 2 hours. The remaining $900,000 will be paid in 30 days. All we need is your signature and immediate restoration of access. I took the document and read through it carefully. It was legitimate. Every clause I'd requested, every safeguard, every operational restriction. They'd actually agreed to it all. But something felt wrong. Where's the acceptance signature from Peak? I asked. We're authorized to execute on behalf of the company, Elliot said quickly. Time is critical here, Ms. Miles. The longer those systems are down, the more leverage I have, I interrupted. That's what you're really worried about, isn't it? You're afraid that if I wait another few hours, I'll realize I can ask for more. Elliot's expression tightened. That would be negotiating in bad faith. No, that would be responding to market conditions. But don't worry, Mr. Hartman. I'm not interested in bleeding them dry. I just want what's fair. I grabbed a pen from the side table by my door and signed the contract. Then I handed it back to him. Access will be restored within the hour, I said. But tell Colton something for me. Tell him that the only reason his company is still functional right now is because I built systems that could survive his incompetence. And tell Garrett that if he touches any of those systems without proper review, the agreement includes termination clauses. I will pull the plug again, and next time there won't be a grace period. Elliot nodded, visibly relieved, and practically jogged back to his car. I closed the door, went to my laptop, and began the reactivation sequence. It took 43 minutes to restore full functionality, not because it was complicated but because I took my time and made sure everything was properly logged and documented. By 11 a.m. the monitoring systems were back online. By 11:15 my phone started buzzing with messages again, this time with a very different tone. Greg from IT, thank you. Seriously. You saved us. Lydia, I don't know what happened behind the scenes, but I'm glad you're being recognized for your work. Even if it's too late. Even Christina from HR sent a message. Wire transfer just processed. $900,000. I've never seen accounting move that fast in my life. I checked my bank account. She wasn't lying. The money was there. For the first time in 22 years, I'd been paid what I was actually worth. The presentation that afternoon, the one Elliot had been so worried about, apparently went off without a major hitch. I heard through the grapevine, a former colleague who'd kept in touch, that Colton had stood in front of a room full of investors and claimed the brief systems maintenance window was part of a planned upgrade cycle. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? The numbers all looked good, the dashboards were functional, and Colton had that executive gift of making disasters sound like strategic decisions. But something had shifted. The board of directors, who'd been absent from day-to-day operations for years, suddenly started asking questions. Who built these systems? Why was there a single point of failure? What's the succession plan if key personnel leave? Uncomfortable questions. The kind that make CFOs sweat and nepotism hires squirm. Garrett, I learned, had been temporarily reassigned to a special projects team with no direct reports and no budget. Corporate speak for, sit in a corner and don't break anything else while we figure out what to do with you. The modernization initiative was put on indefinite hold pending a full infrastructure audit by the third-party firm I'd mandated in the contract. Turns out when you actually review systems properly instead of just slashing them based on buzzwords, you discover that most of them exist for very good reasons. I didn't gloat. Didn't send snarky emails or make passive-aggressive social media posts. I just moved on. A week after the contract was signed, I got an email from a woman named Simone Laurent. Subject line, Consulting Opportunity, Confidential. Ms. Miles, I represent a venture capital firm that specializes in mid-market technology investments. Your work at Peak Dynamics came to our attention during a recent due diligence review of one of their competitors. We're particularly impressed by your infrastructure architecture and risk management protocols. Would you be open to discussing a consulting arrangement? We have several portfolio companies that could benefit from your expertise. Compensation would be project-based, significantly above industry standard, with full creative control over implementations. Please let me know if you'd be interested in a preliminary conversation. I read the email 3 times. Then I checked the signature. Simone Laurent, senior partner, Catalyst Ventures. A quick search confirmed they were legitimate. A well-respected firm with a portfolio worth over $2 billion. I replied, Ms. Laurent, I'm interested. Let's talk. 2 days later, I was on a video call with Simone and two of her colleagues, discussing infrastructure needs for a fintech startup they'd recently acquired. The company was growing fast, drowning in technical debt, and desperately needed someone who could build systems that scaled properly. Someone exactly like me. They offered me a 6-month contract at $45,000 per month plus equity options. Nearly 3 times what I'd been making at peak annually, for half the stress and none of the corporate politics. I accepted on the spot. By the end of October, I'd signed consulting agreements with 3 different companies through Catalyst Ventures. DataShield Consulting, the LLC I'd kept dormant for over a decade, was suddenly a thriving business with more work than I could handle alone. I started hiring. Not random contractors, but people I'd trained over the years who'd been laid off or pushed out by companies that didn't value institutional knowledge. Greg from Peak actually reached out asking if I had any openings. He'd quit 2 weeks after I left, tired of being blamed for problems Garrett had created. I brought him on immediately. By December, DataShield Consulting had 8 employees, 4 active clients, and a waiting list of companies that had heard about us through word of mouth. Turns out there's a huge market for people who actually know how to build things properly instead of just making them look good on PowerPoint slides. I kept the Peak licensing agreement active partly because the money was good, but mostly because the operational safeguards I'd built into the contract meant I got quarterly reports on their infrastructure status. It was like having a window into my old life, watching them slowly realize just how much I'd been holding together. They tried to hire a replacement for me 3 times. Every candidate took one look at the tangled mess of systems, the lack of documentation and the organizational chaos, and either declined the offer or quit within 3 months. The 4th candidate they hired was someone I'd trained 8 years ago, a sharp developer named Kayla who'd moved to a competitor but maintained friendly contact. She called me before accepting the position. Oakley, they want me to take over your old role. I told them I'd only do it if they agreed to bring you on as a paid advisor. Is that something you'd consider? I thought about it for approximately 5 seconds. Only if the advisory contract goes through DataShield, not directly through Peak. And only if Garrett Rivers is prohibited from interfering with infrastructure decisions. Already negotiated both of those, Kayla said with a laugh. Garrett's not even in the building anymore. He took a job at his father-in-law's company. Something in marketing, I think. That's probably for the best, I replied. For everyone. I signed the advisory contract in January. It was small, just 10 hours a month. But it paid $500 per hour and came with explicit language that I had veto power over any major infrastructure changes. Essentially, they were paying me to occasionally tell them not to do stupid things. It was the easiest money I'd ever made. February brought an unexpected phone call. Colton Rivers, calling from his personal cell phone on a Saturday morning. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity got the better of me. Colton, I said neutrally. Oakley. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I'm reading a book in my backyard. So yes, you're interrupting, but I'm listening. He was quiet for a moment and I could hear wind in the background. He was outside somewhere away from the office. I wanted to apologize, he said finally, for how things went down. You deserved better. I set my book down, genuinely surprised. That's unexpected, I admitted. It's also overdue. I let my personal feelings about legacy systems and modern efficiency cloud my judgment. And I let my relationship with Garrett compromise my professional obligations to the company and to people like you who'd actually earned their positions. People like me, I repeated. You mean people who weren't related to executives? Yes, he said bluntly. That's exactly what I mean. The board made it very clear during the infrastructure review that nepotism is no longer going to be tolerated. I've been mandated to implement formal hiring practices with external oversight. Garrett's hiring violated about 6 different policies that we'd let slide because I'm the CFO and I could. And how's Garrett doing? I asked, more curious than vindictive. He's struggling, Colton admitted. Turns out being handed things doesn't prepare you for actually earning them. His new job isn't working out. He's talking about going back to school for a different degree. Maybe something in teaching. Teaching could be good for him, I said diplomatically. If he approaches it with humility. That's generous of you considering. I'm not angry at Garrett, I said honestly. He's young and he was given opportunities he wasn't ready for by people who should have known better. That's not his fault. It's yours. Colton absorbed that without arguing. Fair point. Look, I know things between us are never going to be what they were. But I wanted you to know that the company is doing better now. Kayla's doing excellent work. The infrastructure audit came back with surprisingly positive results. Apparently you'd built in safeguards even we didn't know existed. And we're actually profitable again after 2 rough quarters. I'm glad to hear it, I said and meant it. And I wanted you to know that if you ever wanted to come back. I'm not coming back, Colton. I figured you'd say that. But I had to offer. For what it's worth, we all know now what we lost when you left. You didn't lose me when I left, I corrected him. You lost me when you made it clear that loyalty and competence mattered less than last names and pedigree. The resignation was just me acknowledging reality. He didn't have a response to that. Anyway, he said after a long pause, I won't take up any more of your Saturday. I just wanted to say my piece. Thank you for taking the call, Oakley. Take care, Colton. I hung up and sat there for a while processing the conversation. It would have meant more if he'd apologized when it mattered. If he'd stood up for me in that conference room, or pushed back against Garrett's reckless changes, or even just acknowledged my expertise before I'd been forced to prove its value by taking it away. But late apologies are still apologies. And I wasn't interested in holding grudges. That took energy I'd rather spend on building new things. By spring, DataShield Consulting had grown to 12 employees and had enough recurring revenue that I could afford to be selective about projects. I turned down 3 potential clients in March alone. Not because the money wasn't good, but because their organizational culture reminded me too much of peak. Ego-driven leadership, short-term thinking, and a fundamental disrespect for the people actually doing the work. I'd learned my lesson. I didn't need to accept every opportunity. I could choose environments where my expertise would be valued, not merely tolerated until it became inconvenient. One of my new clients was a nonprofit healthcare network that served rural communities. Their infrastructure was a disaster. Outdated systems held together with hope and zip ties. But their mission was genuine and their leadership actually listened when I explained why things needed to be done properly. I gave them a below-market rate and spent extra hours making sure their systems were bulletproof. Because some work is about more than money. Some work is about building things that matter. That's what I'd forgotten during my years at Peak. I'd been so focused on maintaining systems, preventing disasters, and proving my value to people who'd never fully appreciated that I'd lost sight of why I got into this field in the first place. I liked solving problems. I liked building elegant solutions to complicated challenges. I liked the satisfaction of seeing something work exactly as intended because you'd thought through every possible failure point and planned accordingly. And now I got to do that every day on my own terms for clients who actually gave a damn. In May, I got an invitation to speak at a technology conference in Austin. The topic, Infrastructure as Institutional Knowledge. Why Experience Matters in the Age of Disruption. I almost declined. Public speaking wasn't my thing. But the organizer was persistent, and eventually I agreed to do a workshop session instead of a main stage presentation. Smaller audience, more technical depth, less performative nonsense. 47 people showed up to that workshop. It was supposed to run 90 minutes. We went for 3 hours because people kept asking questions, sharing their own experiences, and comparing notes about companies that had made the same mistakes Peak had. Turns out I wasn't alone. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, of experienced professionals who'd been pushed out, devalued, or sidelined in favor of younger, cheaper workers who looked good on paper but couldn't deliver when things got complicated. After the session, a woman in her 50s approached me. She introduced herself as Helen, a former database architect who'd been laid off after 26 years when her company decided to outsource everything to a contractor in Eastern Europe. They called me back 4 months later, she said with a wry smile, begging me to consult. The outsourcing firm had corrupted their primary database during a migration, and they'd lost critical client records. I told them my consulting rate was $800 an hour. They paid it. Did you fix their problem? I asked. Eventually. After they agreed to pay me for 3 months upfront and signed a contract admitting the layoff was a mistake. I made them put it in writing that they'd failed to properly evaluate the risks of removing experienced staff. I laughed. That must have felt good. It felt necessary, Helen corrected. These companies need to learn that experience isn't a liability. It's an asset. And if they want to treat us as disposable, they need to understand that we'll treat them as temporary clients instead of long-term employers. We exchanged contact information. 2 months later, Helen joined DataShield Consulting as a senior database architect. She brought 3 clients with her. Companies that had learned the hard way that experience matters and were willing to pay for it. By August, DataShield had 18 employees and had turned down more work than we'd accepted. We were profitable, sustainable, and growing at a pace I could actually manage without burning out. And most importantly, I was happy. Actually, genuinely happy in a way I hadn't been in years. September marked 1 year since I'd resigned from Peak Dynamics. I didn't celebrate with champagne or a fancy dinner. I just took the afternoon off, drove to a hiking trail I'd been meaning to visit, and spent 3 hours walking through the woods without checking my phone once. It was perfect. When I got home that evening, there was a package waiting on my doorstep. No return address, just my name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a coffee mug. Custom-made, ceramic with text printed on the side. Legacy systems. Built to last by people who give a damn. There was a note tucked inside the mug. Oakley, thank you for teaching me that efficiency isn't the same as effectiveness, and that experience isn't a synonym for obsolete. You saved my career by teaching me to value the foundations before redesigning the building. Keep doing what you're doing. The industry needs more people like you. Kayla. I made myself a cup of coffee in that mug and sat at my kitchen table, looking out at the backyard as the sun set. People think revenge is about destruction. About burning bridges and salting the earth and making sure your enemies suffer. But that's not revenge. It's just rage. Real revenge is proving them wrong. It's building something better without them. It's walking away from a situation that devalued you and creating a life where your expertise is recognized, respected, and compensated fairly. I didn't destroy Peak Dynamics. I didn't need to. I just stopped holding them up, let them stumble through the consequences of their own decisions, and built something new in the space that opened up. And in the end, that was more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation could have been. The systems I built at Peak were still running. The safeguards I'd put in place were still protecting them. But now they were paying for that protection properly, acknowledging its value, and operating under guidelines that prevented the kind of reckless incompetence that had driven me out in the first place. They'd learned. Eventually. The hard way, the expensive way, but they'd learned. And I'd moved on to environments where I didn't have to fight for basic respect, where my 2 decades of expertise were seen as an asset rather than an inconvenience, and where I could spend my energy building things instead of defending my right to exist. That was the real victory. Not making them suffer, but freeing myself from situations where I had to prove my worth to people who'd never truly understand it. October brought an interesting development. I got a LinkedIn message from someone named Derek Paulson, who identified himself as the new CTO of Peak Dynamics. Ms. Miles, I hope this message finds you well. I joined Peak 3 months ago and have spent most of that time getting up to speed on our infrastructure. I've reviewed the systems you built, the documentation you left behind, and the disaster recovery protocols that saved us during several incidents I wasn't even aware had happened until I dug into the logs. I wanted to reach out personally to say that your work is exceptional. Not just technically proficient, but thoughtfully designed with obvious care for long-term sustainability. I've worked in this industry for 20 years, and I rarely see infrastructure built with this level of foresight. I also wanted to apologize on behalf of the organization for how you were treated. I've read the meeting notes, reviewed the correspondence, and spoken with people who were there. What happened was unprofessional and short-sighted, and I'm sorry you had to experience that. I'm not going to ask you to come back. Based on what I've learned about DataShield Consulting, you're exactly where you should be. But I did want you to know that your legacy here, in the best sense of that word, is being honored and maintained properly now. If you're ever willing to have coffee and discuss infrastructure philosophy, I'd be grateful for the conversation. No agenda, no job offer, just professional respect from one architect to another. Derek. I sat with that message for a day before responding. Derek, thank you for reaching out and for the kind words about the systems. I poured a lot of myself into that infrastructure and it's gratifying to know it's being maintained properly. I appreciate the apology, though I should clarify that I don't hold organizational grudges. The situation that led to my departure was the result of specific decisions by specific individuals, most of whom are no longer in positions to repeat those mistakes. I'm glad the company has moved forward. I'd be happy to have that coffee conversation. I'm always interested in talking shop with people who understand that infrastructure is about more than just keeping the lights on. It's about building foundations that can support growth, adapt to change, and survive the inevitable moments when everything goes wrong at once. Let me know your availability. Oakley. We met for coffee 2 weeks later at a place halfway between my office and Peak headquarters. Derek turned out to be in his early 40s, prematurely gray, with the kind of quiet competence that comes from years of actually doing the work instead of just managing people who do the work. We talked for 2 hours. Not about Peak specifically, but about infrastructure philosophy, the challenges of maintaining legacy systems while enabling innovation, and the industry's troubling tendency to treat experience as a liability. The hardest part of my job, Derek said at one point, is convincing executives that prevention is valuable even though it's invisible. When systems work properly, nobody notices. They only pay attention when things break. So there's constant pressure to cut corners, reduce redundancy, and treat infrastructure as a cost center instead of a foundation. That's why I left, I said. Not because of Garrett specifically, but because that attitude was pervasive. They'd rather take risks and look efficient on paper than invest in proper safeguards. Until something catastrophic almost happened, and then suddenly prevention became a priority again. For about 3 months, until the next budget cycle. Derek nodded. I've fought that battle at every company I've worked for. The difference at Peak now is that the board is actually paying attention. That near miss you orchestrated, and yes, I know it was orchestrated and I respect the hell out of it, scared them badly enough that they're willing to invest properly. At least for now. How long do you think that'll last? I asked. 2 years, maybe 3, before someone new comes in and decides we're overinvested in infrastructure. Then the cycle starts again. He smiled ruefully. But that's the nature of the industry. We're Cassandras, warning about disasters nobody wants to believe in until they've already happened. So why do you keep doing it? I asked. Same reason you do, I suspect. Because someone has to build things properly. And because on the rare occasions when everything works exactly as designed, when a disaster is averted before anyone even knows it was coming, there's a quiet satisfaction in knowing you did something that mattered. I raised my coffee cup in a mock toast. To invisible victories and unappreciated expertise. Derek clinked his cup against mine. And to getting paid what we're worth, eventually, by someone. We stayed in touch after that. Not frequently, just occasional emails comparing notes on challenging projects or sharing articles about industry trends. It was nice to have a peer who understood the work at a technical level instead of just treating it as a black box that either worked or didn't. By the end of the year, DataShield Consulting had 22 employees, offices in 2 cities, an annual revenue that exceeded what I'd made in my entire decade at Peak. We'd become known in certain circles as the firm you called when you needed infrastructure built properly, not cheaply. When you valued experience over trendiness and substance over style. We turned down more work than we accepted, which gave us leverage to be selective about clients and culture. I'd instituted a policy that we wouldn't work with companies that treated their internal technical staff poorly, or that had a pattern of laying off experienced workers to cut costs. Some people called it idealistic. I called it sustainable. Because the truth was, I didn't want to build DataShield into a massive consultancy with hundreds of employees and standardized processes. I wanted to maintain something smaller, more intentional, where everyone who worked there felt valued and respected. Where experience was an asset, not a liability. Where we could do excellent work without sacrificing our dignity or our principles. That was the real lesson I'd learned from Peak. It wasn't that corporations are inherently evil or that executives can't be trusted. It was that culture matters. Leadership matters. And sometimes the best thing you can do for your career, your health, and your self-respect is to walk away from environments that devalue what you bring to the table. Even if it means starting over. Even if it means taking risks. Even if it means proving yourself all over again to people who've never heard your name. Because the alternative, staying in a place that slowly erodes your confidence, undermines your expertise, and treats you as disposable, that's not stability. That's just a slow-motion disaster you've learned to tolerate. Christmas Eve, I was closing down the office early. We gave everyone the last week of December off with full pay, when my phone rang. A known number, but this time I recognized the area code. It was from the town where I'd grown up, 3 states away. I answered cautiously. Is this Oakley Miles? An older woman's voice, warm but formal. Speaking. Miss Miles, my name is Dorothy Brennan. I'm the superintendent of Clearwater Unified School District. I'm calling because we're trying to modernize our student information systems, and we've run into some significant challenges. Your name came up during a consultation with a technology firm we hired, and they suggested we reach out to you directly. A school district. That was new. What kind of challenges? I asked. Well, we have student records going back 40 years stored in about 6 different database formats, some of them proprietary systems from companies that no longer exist. We need to migrate everything to a modern platform without losing any data, but every vendor we've consulted has basically said it's impossible, or quoted us prices we can't afford. I smiled. This was exactly the kind of problem I loved. It's not impossible, I said. It's just complicated. And expensive if you hire people who don't know what they're doing. That's what we were afraid of. Ms. Miles, I'm going to be direct with you. We're a small district, mostly rural, not a lot of budget flexibility. But this data represents 4 decades of student histories and we can't afford to lose it. Is this something you'd be willing to consult on? I thought about the nonprofit healthcare network I'd helped earlier in the year. About the satisfaction of solving problems for organizations that actually mattered, even when the money wasn't as good as corporate contracts. Send me the details, I said. Scope of the project, timeline, whatever technical documentation you have. I'll review it and let you know if it's something we can help with. Thank you, Ms. Miles. I really appreciate it. We ended the call and I sat there for a moment looking around the office. 22 employees, sustainable revenue, interesting work, respect from clients and peers. This was what success looked like, even if it didn't match the trajectory I'd imagined 20 years ago when I first started building systems for Summit Technologies. But maybe that was okay. Maybe success wasn't about climbing the corporate ladder or achieving some predefined notion of professional achievement. Maybe it was about building something meaningful on your own terms, with people who shared your values, in service of work that mattered. And if that meant taking on projects for school districts that couldn't afford typical consulting rates, or helping nonprofits build infrastructure they desperately needed, or creating opportunities for experienced professionals who'd been cast aside by companies that didn't value them, well, that seemed like a pretty good way to spend a career. I locked up the office, got in my car and drove home through the quiet streets. Snow was starting to fall, light and peaceful, covering everything in a clean white blanket. The coffee mug Kayla had sent me was sitting on my desk at home. I'd make myself a cup tomorrow morning, sit at my kitchen table and start reviewing the documentation for the school district project. Because that's what I did. I built systems. I solved problems. I turned complicated messes into elegant solutions. And nobody, not Colton Rivers, not Garrett, not any executive who'd ever underestimated me, could take that away. That was mine. It always had been. The book. 3 years later, DataShield Consulting had 38 employees, offices in 4 cities, and a reputation that extended far beyond the technology sector. We'd worked with healthcare systems, educational institutions, nonprofit organizations, and a handful of carefully selected corporate clients who'd proven they valued expertise over expedience. The Clearwater School District project had been featured in an education technology journal as a case study in successful legacy system migration. Other districts had reached out and we'd helped 17 of them modernize their infrastructure without losing decades of critical student data. Peak Dynamics was still a client. Derek Paulson was still their CTO. And under his leadership they'd become more stable, more thoughtful about technical decisions, and more willing to invest in proper infrastructure. Garrett Rivers was teaching high school business classes and, according to Derek, had apparently found his calling. Some people just needed time to find where they actually belonged. Colton Rivers had retired. Not forced out, just ready to step away. His replacement was a woman named Angela Torres who'd worked her way up from entry-level accounting to CFO over 18 years. She'd called me once to introduce herself and thank me for setting important precedents about how this company values institutional knowledge. I'd taken that compliment and not asked too many questions. My team at DataShield was exactly what I'd hoped to build. Experienced professionals who'd been undervalued elsewhere, younger developers who wanted to learn from people who'd actually built things instead of just read about them, and a culture that treated expertise as an asset worth investing in. We weren't perfect. We had challenges, made mistakes, and occasionally took on projects that turned out to be more complicated than anticipated. But we faced those challenges as a team, learned from our mistakes, and supported each other through the difficult projects. And at the end of every day, I could look at what we'd built and feel proud. Not because we'd grown fast or made headlines or achieved some arbitrary measure of success, but because we'd created something sustainable, something meaningful, something that reflected the values I'd spent 22 years trying to uphold in environments that didn't always appreciate them. The coffee mug Kayla had given me was still my favorite. I used it every morning, a reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction or confrontation or proving people wrong in dramatic fashion. Sometimes it's just building something better and moving forward without looking back. The systems I'd built at Peak were still running, still protecting them, still quietly doing the work they were designed to do. And I was still building systems, just for different clients, under different terms, with the respect and compensation I'd always deserved. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything.